Hello everybody. Welcome back to Organizational Psychology. We are going to talk a little bit about organizational culture and talk about a homework assignment embedded in this as well. So, let us begin. I love this graphic. The idea, organizational culture eats a strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And there's an awful lot of people who emphasize strategy, but believe me, if you don't have the culture in place or the culture won't support it, all the strategy in the world is frickin' meaningless. So I'm going to attempt to make the case here for the importance of organizational culture. And you can see that we've talked extensively about Deming at this point, and Deming is talking about, through his 14 points and his 7 deadly diseases, those that support a positive culture versus those that destroy a culture. Right? So let's define culture. It's the set of shared, taken for granted, implicit assumptions that a group holds that determines how it perceives, how it thinks about, and how it reacts to its various environments, its various opportunities, and its various challenges. Right? I don't know if I probably haven't discussed this metaphor in this class yet. It's a common metaphor that I use in other classes. When Dr. Dick Nisbet came and spoke to us at Ohio State, he asked us the question, does a fish know it's wet? And we're all like, yeah, I mean, are we going to have a talk? Are we going to get serious at some point? But it was the lead into his talk. And the idea is a fish does not know it's wet because it doesn't know any different. And this kind of captures the taken for granted implicit assumptions, right? Is the wetness in which employees, exist that are the cultural phenomenon that have been thrust upon them. So if we want to understand organizational culture, we need to look at it in its various component pieces, and by now you should be used to kind of, this isn't a flowchart, more of a systems model, if you will, for its explanatory power. If we're going to understand organizational culture, we have to then start with the antecedents, the organizational structure and processes, group and social processes, the collective attitudes and behavior, and the organizational outcomes. And let's see how this all fits together. The antecedents, what creates the culture, or what sets the culture up to be created, if you will, the founder's values, the company founder's values. And we see that often companies persist for a long time, and the founder is long gone, and the new management doesn't necessarily adhere to the founder's values, and they wonder why the culture is changing, right? So, and you know about the importance of values because this is where we started the course, right? What is the industry and business dictates culture to a certain extent, right? What is the national culture in which the organization is embedded? And note that when we get into the kind of this global corporations, this becomes complex because you're operating, let's say, a corporation in many different national cultures. What impact does that have? What is a senior's leader vision and behavior? And notice, do they line up, right? So now this goes then to kind of cause the organizational culture, and one way that we assess organizational culture is the observable artifacts. More on that in a little bit. What are the espoused values? And again, we return to that idea of values. And what are the basic assumptions dictating how people should be treated, right? What type of organization is it? And what is their role in the larger world? Now, the organizational culture, right, then dictates what structures and processes will be found in the organization. So it will dictate the nature of the reward systems if they exist at all, right? The organizational design, is it flat, is it hierarchical, is at the most basic differentiation. So these then dictate or sometimes control or enhance group and social processes. So what is the process of socialization? Something we'll discuss in this lecture as well. How does mentoring take place, if at all? What is the decision-making style and the decision-making process? right? What do group dynamics look like in the organization as a function of the culture? What is the communication and what is the influence and empowerment structure? These then will, and leadership, and this will yield then the collective attitudes and behavior. And this is something, we'll have an assignment coming up to assess, to design a measure of employee satisfaction, for example. So what are the work attitudes, and what is the level of job satisfaction, and what does the motivational quality look like within the organization? And then finally, this kind of dictates what's going to happen ultimately with the organization. What are the outcomes? How effective is the organization? What is the level of stress that people undergo in the organization? What does their retention look like? And note, this is a critical measure because people who are generally satisfied, feel fulfilled, find meaning in their work, and are paid reasonably well, are usually retained. Or do we have a rapid and fast turnover in the organization? So let's kind of take these, components that we just looked at and kind of flesh them out a little bit. Values. What are values? Well, we know to a certain extent because we've done an assignment, but it really is an enduring belief in a mode of conduct or a desired end state, right? And when we're talking a desired end state, we're talking terminal values, right? The mode of conduct would be instrumental values. So you may hear those terms. Instrumental is how we do business, and terminal values are what do we want to be when it's all said and done. Now, espoused values are the values that are stated by the organization. You guys looked at websites to look at that. The nice thing about values, at least it's supposed to be, is that they transcend the situation. So values, situations vary, but values should be consistent, right? And values should guide us through all, through all situations, right? Values can also serve as the basis for measures, strangely enough. That is, we can, state values and measure our conformance to the values. So we can see how we're doing in relation to our values. Values, we know, can be ordered in, put in order of their relative importance, and that's part of the exercise that we did earlier in the class. But values in practice, it's good for espoused values. Enacted values, what do we know? Well, they represent the values, the norms that manifest themselves in actual behaviors. So it's, walk the walk, right? So instead of, adhering to the talk. Enacted values are observable. We can actually see them in operation. Enacted values are more likely to be what employees say the organization values. People are generally not all that stupid, right? If the company says, hey, this is what we value, this is what we say, but then when the rubber meets the road, we can look at what the company actually does. People are more likely to go with the behavior rather than the statement of values. And acted values are more likely to be what the company measures or pays attention to. And as I described in an earlier story, when we were finishing up our Total Quality Recognition Day, and Pete said, well, probably need to cut this recognition day short, because we got to get back to work and get tons out the door. He was indicating that recognition is nice and it's cool and kumbaya, folks, but what we're really about is making paper and making tons of paper, so let's get back to our real business, right? And it's like, wow. That's what people notice. That's what people pay attention to. And this part of the story I don't think I included, but the vice presidents and the president provided us a written feedback report on their experience of Recognition Day. And that's one thing that they did, in fact, mention. They noticed, and they came back to mention it. So, let's look at these observable artifacts. Can we observe values? Well, what is dress or uniforms, right? And there's a certain level of dress that would be expected of an employee at Starbucks, right? I know some of you and some students I met at Columbus State as well work for Honda up in Marysville. And notice in Honda Marysville, everyone wears white, right? They wear their white kind of lab coat, etc. Everyone, regardless of rank. Notice that some organizations dress flexibility of dress is on the basis of rank. So if you go to McDonald's, you'll see a manager is probably wearing, street clothes, whereas everyone else is expected to be in uniform. What does that mean, and what does that say? And when we call these observable artifacts, what meaning can we derive from what we observe? How do we go from our observation to the underlying or implicit value, as we opened up the lecture? Grooming and Disneyland. I worked at Disneyland a couple holiday seasons and a couple summers. My dad worked at Disneyland in the band, and I would work at Disneyland when I was staying with him. And I remember one of the jobs I had at Disneyland was working at the Sunkissed food place. We had orange juice, lemonade, Jungle Punch, because it was right across from Jungle Cruise and right across from the Swiss Family Robinson Treehouse. This is Southern California Disneyland. And we served food too. There was donuts, believe it or not, orange flavored donuts, and hot dogs. And my job, I worked in the back almost 99% of the time, making a billion hot dogs a shift, making sure the orange squeezing machine was filled with oranges, making the lemonade from concentrate, etc., in the big 55-gallon chilled devices, right? But grooming, Disneyland, man, it was like no hair. Your hair can't touch your collar, right? And no sideburns, no facial hair whatsoever. And they're serious about it. And I worked in the back. No one ever frickin' saw me. And I remember one day they came by and they said, "Paula Frone." And I said, "Yeah." And they said, and this is just some random supervisor, not even my direct manager, right? Says, "We mentioned your hair last week, and it looks like you haven't done anything about it." And I'm like, "Well, whatever." And they said, "Well, tell you what, at the end of your shift, we're going to take you over to the barber, and we're going to get that fixed up for you." So that was the nature of grooming and the adherence to grooming at Disneyland. They were deadly serious, right? But Disneyland tried to control every aspect of the guest's experience, and grooming appearance was part of it. Language, acronyms. To what extent does an organization use certain language, certain vocabulary, or certain acronyms, and then what does that say about the organization? Let's face it, military, that's an organization. They love their frickin' acronyms. Everyone speaks in acronyms. What does that mean when you're using an acronym instead of saying it out? What do you value under those circumstances? What does it say about your culture? Decorations. What do they look like? Are they allowed? Are they mandated? Are they individualized? Are they, what's the story? Building, interior design. And how does it function? How do people move through it? And what does it say? Right? Do you have offices or do you have cubes? Quality of equipment. And this matters as well. Right? Because this tells us how perhaps you as a worker are valued depending on the quality of the equipment you're operating. What are people receiving awards for? What ceremonies are conducted? For what purpose? And what does it tell us then about the culture? What are the myths? What are the stories that people tell about what's happened in the past? Right? What are the statements of values, right? And what are the lessons to be learned from that? So these are all visible artifacts. The quality of the facilities. Is it run down? Is it well kept? Right? Quality of the facilities. I'll go back to Disneyland again. One of the things, they had area supervisors at Disneyland who kind of oversaw the employees that worked in a certain area. So let's say you were a supervisor for Main Street. It was kind of your deal to make sure that everything about Main Street was just so. And this is cruel, but one thing the supervisors would do, one thing you might be familiar with at Disneyland is the guys that walk around with the little broom and the little dustpan, right, on the handle, and they're always cleaning up everywhere. And one thing the supervisors would do is they would get a thing of popcorn, they would eat some popcorn, and then they would just throw it on the ground, and then they would start the timer. And they had a specification that no debris could be on the ground longer than 2 or 3 minutes, right? And so the quality of the facilities was attended to seriously to the point where they were timing employees' ability to get it cleaned up. Right? So, quality of the facilities, and there's other lessons we can or impressions we can form on the basis of this. So, when we look at the layers of organizational culture, some basic assumptions. Values that have persisted over time become invisible, that they're off the radar, that everyone operates according to those, especially the long-standing employees who just become used to it, we become adapted to it. Deep-seated so much that they may function out of awareness, as we described in the first or second slide. And then potential for guiding automatic behaviors that are beneficial as well as behaviors that are damaging. So it's in looking at culture, right, if we want to cause habitual behaviors, right, if we want to cause routinized behaviors, things that happen automatically, and many of us are psychology majors, so we're really in line with this, creating policy, right, that dictates certain behaviors can create kind of a self-motivating culture. But if we allow bad things to happen and they go unaddressed, then we can watch that culture begin to deteriorate and cause more and more negative outcomes and less satisfaction. So attention to detail, my advisor, Phil Tetlock, my first advisor, we used to sit down, we'd talk about doing research, certain studies, and he says, yeah, Mark, but you know that the devil is always in the details. And so it is in operating an organization. To just say, well, I'm not going to worry about it because it's not that big a deal, might be a mistake that operates in a hidden fashion. So, why culture? What are the functions of culture? Well, organizational culture derives 4 functions. The culture helps us make sense in what we're doing and why we do it. Why are we here? Why do we do it this way? So culture kind of contributes to our ability to make sense, the meaning of what we do, right? Culture also helps with organizational identity, right? So the organizational culture can dictate to a certain extent the identity of the organization, but also the identity of the people within the organization. Okay? It can foster collective commitment or it can destroy collective commitment, but it certainly has an impact on collective commitment. And culture, really, strong cultures contribute to social system stability, right? Which helps make sense over the long term. Just because these are arrayed independently off of organizational culture doesn't mean that there aren't arrows, bidirectional arrows that go between the circles in this diagram as well. So, can we say about evidence from organizational culture research? Well, organizational culture is significantly correlated with employee attitudes and behavior. So, those that are thought to be positive cultures, we usually see generally higher employee satisfaction and more pro-social, pro-organizational behaviors. Congruence between an individual's values and the organizational's values was associated with organizational commitment, higher job satisfaction, lower intentions to quit, and lower turnover. When we look at Southwest Airlines made it very clear, at least in their beginning, that we're going to hire for values and we're going to train for skills, because you can't train values. So you assess the values and you hire people who have values that are consistent with your own. Build skills from there, right? Organizational culture doesn't predict a company's financial performance necessarily. At least not in the short to medium term. Over the long term, one might foster an argument that it does. Mergers frequently fail due to incompatible cultures, and that's when we have 2 organizations that must merge. There's a lot of sorting out to be done, and if they have wildly incompatible cultures, it's somewhat predictive of that merger not being successful. Now, 3 perspectives on what constitutes a successful culture. One is the strength of the culture, and that's been shown to be associated with financial success. But the problem with the strength of a culture is we might become so inwardly focused that we become somewhat arrogant in terms of our culture, and therefore lose our flexibility and adaptability. I would say that Facebook is probably strong culture, right? But very inwardly focused and becomes somewhat arrogant in the way they do business and will ultimately lead to their demise, I would think. Now, fit. Culture must be aligned with business environment, and there's a lot to be said for this. A culture that's appropriate to a given business environment probably makes sense, right? The customer is always right. What do you think? Well, as a range master who operated a shooting range for 6 years, I will say that the customer might want to be right, but if a customer is handling a firearm in a manner that's unsafe, then they must be corrected. So notice that type of culture, if you go into a shooting range, whether it's a military range, a public range, a private range, whatever, the culture is that the range master is in charge and the range master's word is final. And you don't argue with the range master, whether you're a customer or not. But that might not work in a restaurant, where it's better to say, well, you know, you feel your food's too salty, let me get you a new meal, right? Because in that case, then adapting to the customer's needs might be appropriate, whereas in other cultures it might not. I mean, in other organizations. So, and fit is hardly all there is to success. There's a lot more, but it can facilitate success. Now, the adaptive culture is adapt as change is demanded, right? But problem with adaptive cultures and flexible perspectives is a lot of times then the organization is viewed as having no core culture and might be labeled hypocritical among other things, or disingenuous, or just kind of floating along with the breeze, whichever way it blows. Let's call this the end of part 1 and move on to part